The silent life I chose. I never believed in showing off. I never cared about expensive watches, loud cars, or people clapping for success. That was never my style. I was the kind of man who worked quietly in the background, building something real, something stable, something that could last a lifetime. While others chased attention, I chased security. While others posted their lives for strangers, I kept mine private. And maybe that was my first mistake, not because privacy is wrong, but because silence can hide truths that should be seen, especially in a marriage. When I met Sarah, things were simple. We were both struggling in our own ways, trying to figure life out, trying to build something together. She used to smile at the smallest things. We would sit on the floor of our tiny apartment eating cheap takeout, laughing about dreams that felt too big for our reality. Back then she said she loved me for who I was. She said she did not care about money. She said all she wanted was a life filled with honesty and warmth, and I believed her completely. I gave her everything I could, not in luxury but in effort. I worked long hours. I came home tired, but still made time for her, still listened, still tried to be present. And slowly over the years things started to change. My career began to grow. Opportunities came that I never expected, promotions, raises, new responsibilities, and before I even realized it, I had reached a point where I was earning more than I ever imagined, around $130,000 a year. It felt unreal, but I did not celebrate loudly. I did not change my lifestyle dramatically. I simply saved, invested, and continued living simply like I always had. And at first I thought I would tell her. I really did. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed one night looking at her, thinking, this is the moment, this is when I share everything. But something stopped me, something small but powerful, a memory of how she spoke about other people, how her tone changed when she talked about rich men, how her eyes lit up when she described luxury, and how her voice carried a certain disappointment when she spoke about our life. It was not obvious at first. It came in small comments, small comparisons that slowly grew sharper. Over time she would say things like, look at them, they travel every year, or my friend just got a new house, why are we still here? And I would sit there quietly wondering if she was unhappy with me or with the life she thought I could not provide. And that is when the thought entered my mind, what if I do not tell her? What if I wait? What if I see if her love is truly for me and not for what I have? So I stayed silent, not out of fear, but out of curiosity mixed with a quiet need for reassurance. I told myself it was just temporary, just until I felt certain, just until I knew her heart had not changed. But days turned into months and months into years, and that conversation never happened. Instead, I continued living the role she believed I fit. I drove my old car, wore the same simple clothes, never showed any sign of the financial growth happening behind the scenes. I paid every bill without hesitation. I made sure she never had to worry about rent or groceries, but I never explained how easily I could handle it. I let her believe we were just getting by, and in the beginning nothing seemed wrong. Life continued as usual, but slowly I began to notice shifts in her behavior. Her patience started to fade. Her kindness became conditional. Her tone carried frustration more often than warmth. She would look at me sometimes as if measuring me against something I could not see, and I started hearing the comparisons more clearly now. Why can you not do more? Why are we stuck like this? Do you even try to improve your life? And each time she said those words, something inside me tightened, not because they were true, but because I knew they were based on a version of me that did not exist. I wanted to tell her, I wanted to say, you have no idea what I do for us. You have no idea how much I have built for our future. But I stayed quiet because I needed to know if she would stay even without that knowledge, if her love could survive without the comfort of money, or if it depended on it more than she realized. And maybe part of me was afraid that once she knew, everything would change, not in a good way, but in a way that would prove my fears right. So I endured the comments, the comparisons, the subtle disrespect that grew louder. With time I told myself, this is what love is. This is what commitment looks like. You stay even when it hurts, you give even when you feel unseen, you hold on even when the other person starts to let go. And for a long time I convinced myself that was enough, that one day she would see me clearly again. One day she would appreciate the man who stood beside her through everything without needing recognition. But that day never came. Instead, the distance between us grew wider. She started spending more time outside, more time on her phone, more time talking about other people, other lives, other possibilities, and I could feel myself fading in her eyes, becoming less of a partner and more of a disappointment, someone she tolerated rather than valued. And still I said nothing. I kept waking up early, going to work, returning home with the same quiet routine, carrying a secret that was no longer just about money, but about truth, about identity, about the reality of who I was versus who she believed I was. And every night as I lay beside her, I felt the weight of that silence pressing down on me, wondering how something so simple could become so complicated, wondering how love that once felt so genuine could slowly turn into something filled with doubt and distance. And yet, despite everything, despite the growing tension, the unspoken Resentment, the quiet sadness that followed me through each day. I held on to one belief that maybe, just maybe, beneath all the frustration, beneath all the expectations, there was still a part of her that loved me, for me, a part that would choose me even if I never revealed the life I had built. And that hope kept me going. It kept me silent. It kept me patient even as everything around me slowly began to fall apart, because I thought love meant endurance. I thought love meant proving your loyalty by staying no matter what. I thought love meant giving without expecting anything in return, and I was willing to do that for her. I was willing to be misunderstood if it meant preserving something real. But deep down, a quiet voice kept asking a question I tried to ignore: how long can love survive when it is built on a truth that is never shared? And I did not have the answer yet, but I would soon learn it the hard way. It was a night that started like any other long, exhausting day that blurred into the next. I left work later than usual, my body heavy, my mind numb from hours of focusing on numbers, meetings, and quiet responsibilities that no one ever really noticed. The sky was dark and heavy with rain, the kind that made the streets shine under the streetlights like broken glass. I remember sitting in my car for a moment before starting the engine, taking a deep breath as if I could leave all the weight of the day behind me before driving home to a place that no longer felt warm but still held the word home out of habit more than truth. The rain fell harder as I pulled onto the road, the sound steady, almost calming in a strange way, and for a few minutes everything felt distant, like I was moving through a tunnel, disconnected from the world around me. My thoughts drifted to Sarah like they always did, wondering if tonight would be different, wondering if she would smile again like she used to, wondering if somehow things would go back to the way they were before silence took over everything between us. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel as I drove through the empty streets. Traffic was light, the city felt half asleep, and I remember thinking how quiet everything was, how peaceful it almost seemed like a pause before something I could not yet see. Then it happened in a single moment that stretched into something endless. Headlights burst through the intersection, too fast, too bright, a truck running a red light with no sign of stopping. I barely had time to react. There was no warning, no chance to move out of the way, just a sudden violent impact that shattered everything around me. The sound was deafening, metal crushing glass exploding, the force throwing my body sideways. Pain shot through me, sharp and immediate, and then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, the world was different. The air smelled sterile, cold machines beeped steadily around me, and a dull aching pain wrapped around my entire body like a constant reminder that something had gone terribly wrong. I tried to move, but the pain stopped me instantly. My chest burned, my leg felt heavy and distant, like it did not belong to me, and for a moment panic crept in as I struggled to understand where I was, what had happened. A nurse noticed I was awake and rushed over, speaking gently, telling me I was in the hospital, that I had been in an accident, that I was lucky to be alive. Lucky, the word echoed in my mind, but it did not feel like luck. It felt like everything had been torn apart without warning. My first thought was not about the pain, not about the injuries, not about the months of recovery they told me I would need. My first thought was Sarah. I looked around the room expecting to see her sitting there waiting, worried, holding on to hope the way I always had for us, but the chair beside my bed was empty. I told myself it was too soon. Maybe she had not been informed yet. Maybe she was on her way. Maybe she was just late. Hours passed slowly, each minute stretching longer than the last. Every sound in the room felt louder, every second heavier. I kept glancing at the door, expecting it to open, expecting her to walk in with concern in her eyes, but it stayed closed. The silence grew louder than the machines around me until it became impossible to ignore the truth. She was not. The night turned into day, and still there was no sign of her. My phone lay on the small table beside me, but I could barely move enough to reach it, and even if I could, I did not know what I would say. How do you ask your own wife why she is not by your side when you need her the most? How do you explain the emptiness of waiting for someone who once promised never to leave? Finally, after what felt like forever, the door opened and she walked in, but something was different immediately. There was no rush, no urgency, no relief on her face, just a quiet sigh, as if she had walked into something inconvenient rather than something tragic. She stood there for a moment, looking at me, not with tears, not with fear, but with a distant expression that felt colder than anything I had ever seen before. I tried to smile, tried to speak, but the words felt heavy in my throat. You came, I said quietly, hoping for something, anything that resembled the warmth we once had. She nodded slightly, glancing around the room before looking back at me. This is going to be expensive, she said. The words hit harder than the accident itself. They settled deep inside me, sharper than pain, more lasting than any injury. I stared at her, unsure if I had heard correctly, unsure if this was really the first thing she wanted to say after everything that had happened. I waited for her to say something else, something human, something that showed she cared, but nothing came. The silence between us felt unbearable, heavier than before, filled with everything she did not say. Over the next few days her visits became shorter and less Frequent each time she came, she seemed more distant, more distracted, as if being there was an obligation she wanted to finish quickly rather than a place she chose to be. Her messages were brief, her tone cold, and I could feel something slipping away completely, something that had already been fragile, breaking beyond repair. And then one morning everything changed in a way I never expected. The door opened again and she walked in, holding papers in her hand. I knew instantly before she even spoke what there was a finality in the way she held them, a decision already made, a path already chosen. Without me, I felt my chest tighten, not from the injuries, but from the realization of what was about to happen. I cannot do this anymore, she said, her voice flat, almost rehearsed, like she had practiced the words before saying them out loud. I looked at her, trying to find the person I used to know, the one who once laughed with me, dreamed with me, stood beside me when life felt uncertain, but she was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. I am in a hospital bed, Sarah, I whispered, my voice breaking under the weight of everything I was feeling, everything I could not fully express. She shrugged slightly, her eyes avoiding mine. Exactly, she replied, as if that single word explained everything, as if my condition, my vulnerability, my need for support was the reason she had chosen to leave rather than stay. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in around me. The machines kept beeping, the world kept moving, but inside me something stopped completely. I realized in that moment that I had been holding on to something that no longer existed, something that had quietly faded while I refused to see it clearly. She placed the papers in front of me, waiting for me to sign them. There was no hesitation in her posture, no sign of doubt, no trace of the love I thought we shared, just a quiet expectation that I would accept this ending as easily as she had decided it. I picked up the pen slowly, my hand trembling, not from weakness, but from the weight of what I was about to do. I could have argued, I could have begged, I could have reminded her of everything we had been through, everything we had built together. But I did none of that, because in that moment I understood something painful but undeniable. If she could walk away from me like this when I was at my lowest, then there was nothing left to fight for. No words could change a heart that had already chosen to leave. So I signed the papers without saying another word. The sound of the pen against the paper felt louder than anything else in the room. Final, irreversible. She took them back without looking at me for more than a second, as if I was already part of her past, as if the man lying in that bed no longer mattered. She turned and walked toward the door, pausing only briefly before leaving, and then she was gone just like that. No goodbye, no apology, no hesitation, just an ending that felt colder than anything I had ever experienced. I lay there staring at the ceiling, unable to process how quickly everything had fallen apart, how the person I once trusted with my entire life had walked away at the moment I needed her most. The pain in my body was nothing compared to the emptiness she left behind. But somewhere deep within that emptiness, something else began to form, not anger, not revenge, but clarity, a quiet understanding that what I had lost was not love but an illusion. And as the door closed behind her, I realized that the hardest part was not the accident, it was waking up to the truth that I had been alone long before that night ever happened. Recovery did not happen overnight. It was slow, it was painful, and it forced me to face a version of myself I had ignored for years. Every morning I woke up to the same sterile ceiling, the same quiet hum of machines, and the same heavy realization that my life had changed in ways I could not undo. The physical pain was constant but predictable. It came in waves that I could prepare for, that I could eventually manage with time and patience. But the emotional weight was different. It was deeper, quieter, and far more difficult to understand, because it was not just about losing Sarah. It was about realizing that I had been holding on to something that was never truly there in the way I believed. During those long hours alone, I had nothing but time to think, no distractions, no excuses, no way to avoid the truth. I started replaying everything from the beginning, every conversation, every moment, every small sign I had ignored because I wanted to believe in something better. I remembered how her tone changed when she spoke about money, how her eyes followed people who lived the kind of life she admired, how her disappointment slowly replaced her warmth. And I asked myself a question that I had avoided for far too long. Did she ever really love me, or did she love the idea of a life she thought I could never give her? And the answer did not come all at once. It revealed itself slowly, painfully, through each memory, each realization, each quiet moment where I could no longer lie to myself. And the truth was simple and hard to accept. I had built a life in silence, hoping that love would exist without conditions, but love without truth is fragile, and I had hidden too much for too long. When I was finally discharged from the hospital, stepping outside felt like entering a new world. The air felt different, the light seemed sharper, everything carried a sense of clarity I had not noticed before. Maybe it was because I had lost everything that once defined my daily life, or maybe it was because I had finally stopped pretending. Either way, I knew I could not go back to the version of myself that existed before the accident. I could not go back to hiding my reality to living smaller than I truly was just to protect a relationship that had already proven it could not survive honesty. So I made a decision that felt both terrifying and freeing. I chose to live openly. I chose to step into the life I had built without apology, without fear, without the need to prove anything to anyone else. I moved out of the apartment we once shared, not because I could not afford it, but because it no longer felt like mine. It was filled with memories that no longer held meaning, reminders of a life built on silence. Instead, I found a new place, one that reflected who I was now, not who I pretended to be. It was not about luxury or showing off. It was about comfort, space, and a sense of ownership over my own life. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to enjoy what I had worked so hard to build. I bought a car not to impress anyone, but because I no longer felt the need to hide my success. I wore clothes that fit the life I lived, not the one I had been pretending to live. I allowed myself small freedoms that once felt unnecessary but now felt essential, not because they changed who I was, but because they reflected it. And with each step forward, I felt something inside me shift, something that had been buried under years of compromise and silence began to rise again. Confidence, not the loud kind, not the kind that seeks validation, but a quiet, steady confidence that comes from knowing your worth without needing anyone else to confirm it. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. My body healed slowly, but my mind changed more rapidly. I started to see things differently. I stopped blaming myself for the way things ended. I stopped questioning whether I could have done more, said more, been more, because the truth was I had already given everything I had, just not in the way she valued. And that was not my failure. It was simply a mismatch of what we believed love should be. One afternoon, as I was sitting in my new living room, sunlight streaming through the windows, I received a message from an old mutual friend, someone who had stayed neutral after the divorce, someone who knew both of us but had never taken sides. At first I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I wanted to revisit anything connected to my past, but curiosity won in the end. Have you heard about Sarah? The message read, simple, direct, and loaded with something I could not immediately define. I stared at the screen for a moment, considering whether I even wanted to know, but something inside me pushed me to respond. No, I replied, keeping it short and detached. The response came quickly. You might want to sit down before I continue. And for a brief second, I almost laughed at how dramatic it sounded, but then I felt a strange tension settle in my chest. Not fear, not sadness, just anticipation of something unexpected. Apparently, after the divorce, Sarah had moved on quickly, not just emotionally, but strategically. She had found someone new almost immediately, someone who represented everything she thought she wanted, someone who displayed wealth openly, who talked about success in a way that sounded impressive, who lived a life that looked perfect from the outside. Luxury trips, expensive dinners, social media filled with images of a lifestyle she had always admired. At first, everything seemed ideal, at least from what people could see. She appeared happier, more confident, more satisfied than she had been in years, and for a moment I wondered if she had made the right choice, if maybe she had simply chosen a life that aligned better with her expectations. But that thought did not last long, because as the message continued, the reality behind that image began to unfold. The man she had chosen was not what he seemed. The wealth was exaggerated, the lifestyle was unstable, the confidence was built on appearances rather than substance. Debt started to surface, inconsistencies became impossible to ignore, promises that once sounded convincing turned into excuses, and slowly the illusion she had chased began to collapse. The relationship did not end dramatically. It unraveled piece by piece as the truth became harder to hide, until eventually there was nothing left to hold on to. No security, no stability, no future, just the realization that she had traded something real for something that only looked real, and lost both in the process. I read the message twice, not because I did not understand it, but because I wanted to be sure. I felt nothing surprising, no anger, no satisfaction, no sense of victory, just a quiet stillness, as if the information had confirmed something I already knew deep down. She had not left me for something better, she had left me for something louder, something more visible, something that matched her expectations on the surface, but lacked the foundation she had once taken for granted. And now she was facing the consequences of that choice. My friend added one final line, she is not doing well financially or emotionally. I think she regrets it. I put my phone down and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling as I let that information settle, not because it changed anything for me, but because it marked the final piece of a story I had already moved beyond. I did not feel the urge to reach out. I did not feel the need to confront her or prove anything to her. I did not even feel curiosity strong enough to ask for more details, because the truth was simple. Our lives had separated in a way that could not be reversed, not because of pride or resentment, but because the connection we once had no longer existed in the same form. She had made her choices based on what she valued, and I had made mine Based on what I learned from losing her, and those paths were never meant to meet again. As the days continued, I found myself thinking less about the past and more about the present, about the life I was now fully living, the opportunities one had once kept hidden, the freedom I had once denied myself. I focused on my work not as an escape but as a source of purpose. I strengthened relationships that were built on honesty rather than assumptions. I allowed myself to experience life without filtering it through someone else's expectations, and slowly I realized something important. I had not just moved on from Sarah, I had moved into a version of myself that I had been holding back for years, a version that did not need approval, did not rely on validation, and did not compromise truth for the sake of comfort. And in that realization I found something unexpected: peace, not the kind that comes from everything going right, but the kind that comes from understanding everything clearly, accepting what was, learning from it, and choosing to move forward without carrying unnecessary weight. The truth she never knew was not just about my income or my success, it was about who I was all along, a man who was capable, who was stable, who was willing to love deeply and give fully, but who also deserved to be seen for all of that without having to prove it through status or wealth. And as I sat there in the quiet of my new life, I understood that some people only recognize value when it is gone, and by the time they do, it is often too late, not because the value disappears, but because the person who once offered it has already learned to live without them. Time has a strange way of changing everything without asking for permission. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and before I realized it, nearly a year had passed since the day I signed those papers in that quiet hospital room. The pain that once felt unbearable had softened into something distant, something that no longer controlled my thoughts or defined my every moment. I had rebuilt my routine piece by piece, waking up each day with a clearer mind, a stronger sense of purpose, and a quiet determination to never lose myself again. The life I had once hidden was now fully visible, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that reflected truth. I no longer drove the old car that carried so many silent memories. I no longer wore the same clothes that made me feel smaller than I was. I no longer pretended to be someone who was struggling just to maintain a version of love that had already faded. Instead, I lived openly and honestly, allowing my reality to exist without apology, and with that openness came a sense of freedom I had never experienced before. I traveled when I wanted, I invested in things that mattered, I built connections that were based on mutual respect rather than assumptions, and most importantly, I learned how to enjoy my own company without feeling the need to fill silence with someone who did not truly understand me. My work continued to grow, not just in income but in meaning. I was no longer working to prove something or to quietly secure a future for someone who might not even stay. I was working for myself, for my peace, for the life I deserved to experience fully. And that shift changed everything. It made success feel lighter, it made achievements feel personal rather than shared with someone who never truly valued them. And somewhere along the way I stopped thinking about Sarah completely, not out of effort, but because my life no longer had space for that chapter. It had ended naturally without the need for closure or explanation. And then one afternoon something unexpected happened, something that felt almost like a scene from a story I had already moved beyond. I was leaving a quiet cafe, the kind of place I had come to enjoy in my new routine, a place where I could sit with my thoughts without interruption. I was dressed simply but well, carrying myself with a confidence that came from within rather than from anything external. And as I stepped outside, I saw her. At first I did not recognize her immediately, not because she had changed completely, but because I had. She stood a few steps away, looking at me with a mixture of shock and disbelief, her eyes scanning me as if trying to confirm that I was real, that the person standing in front of her was the same man she had once walked away from. There was a silence between us that felt heavy but not uncomfortable. It was filled with everything that had been left unsaid, everything that no longer needed to be spoken. "You look different," she said finally, her voice softer than I remembered, almost uncertain, as if she was unsure how to approach this moment. I smiled slightly, not out of politeness but out of calm acknowledgement. "I am," I replied simply, because there was no need to explain further. The difference was not just in appearance, it was in everything, in the way I stood, in the way I spoke, in the way I carried my past without letting it define me. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze shifting as if searching for the right words, or perhaps searching for the version of me she thought she knew. "What do you do now?" she asked. The question came out carefully, but I could hear the curiosity behind it, the need to understand how the man she once underestimated was now standing in front of her with a presence she could not ignore. I looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not with resentment, but with clarity. "The same thing I always did," I said calmly, watching her expression change as confusion slowly replaced curiosity. "I just stopped hiding it." The words landed quietly, but their impact was immediate. I saw it in her eyes, the realization, the connection, the sudden understanding of everything she had never known about me. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something but could not find the words. "You had all this," she began her voice trembling slightly. And you never told me. I nodded. Once, not as an admission of guilt but as a statement of truth. I wanted someone who loved me without it, I said, and in that moment the weight of everything between us became clear, not through accusation or blame but through simple honesty. She looked down briefly as if trying to process what she was hearing, as if replaying her own choices in light of this new understanding. I made a mistake, she whispered. The words were quiet, almost fragile, but they carried a depth that I could feel even without emotion attached to them, and for a brief second I considered what that meant, not for her, but for me, what it would mean to hear those words months ago, what it would have meant to have her realize this before everything fell apart. But that moment had passed. It no longer existed in a way that could change anything, and that was the difference between who I was then and who I had become now. I did not need her regret to validate my worth. I did not need her realization to confirm what I already knew. I hope you find what you are looking for, I said finally, my voice steady, not cold but not inviting either. It was a statement of closure, a quiet ending to something that had already finished long before this moment, and as I turned to leave, I felt no hesitation, no lingering attachment, no desire to stay or continue the conversation, because there was nothing left to resolve, nothing left to understand. Everything had already been learned through distance, through silence, through the process of rebuilding myself. Without her, I walked toward my car, feeling the sun against my face, the world around me moving as it always had, but for the first time I was fully present in it, not weighed down by the past, not distracted by what could have been, but grounded in what was real. And as I drove away, I allowed myself one final thought, not about her, but about everything that had led me to this point. The accident, the betrayal, the silence, the growth, all of it had shaped me in ways I could not have predicted. It had stripped away illusions, forced me to confront truths I had avoided, and ultimately led me to a version of myself that was stronger, clearer, and more complete than before. The sweetest revenge is not about making someone else feel the pain they caused. It is not about proving them wrong or showing them what they lost in a way that demands their attention. The sweetest revenge is living a life so full, so honest, and so aligned with who you truly are that their absence no longer feels like a loss but like a necessary step in your journey. It is waking up each day without resentment, without regret, without the need to look back and question what went wrong, because you already know the answer and you have already moved beyond it. And as the road stretched out in front of me, endless and open, I realized something simple but powerful. I did not lose her, she lost me, and not just the version of me she once knew, but the man I had become. Someone she could no longer reach, someone she could no longer understand, someone who no longer needed her to feel complete. And in that realization I found something greater than closure. I found freedom.